I think it was within 2 years, we were state. Somehow, it's a lucky charm. Now, in the meanwhile, we're skipping over all the hearings and all the problems we were having with lining things up.
Light, camera, action. Within the nation, a video sensation, excitement like never before. There is a kid comedy, the top on TV. Embarrassment is the reward. The future might lie in your own hands. Run and get your video cam. Come and take the video challenge. Light, camera, action.
Ladies and gentlemen, the host of Video Challenge, Steve Kelly.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. You know, for the
And we had to do a few things, I guess you can call it innovating. For instance, we had a problem when the bill was coming up in the Senate for final passage. It took a lot to get it there, all these years, and here it was coming, and we knew it was coming up, and Senator Lyndon Johnson was the floor leader of the Senate, and he was against statehood, and he said he'd never do anything to help get that bill and move it through the Senate. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. And if the floor leader wouldn't carry the bill, how are you going to get the Senate to even consider it? So we had a real problem there, and that's where we had to do some innovating. And it just happened that when the bill came up on the floor of the Senate, Senator Johnson was absent. He was out on the Gulf of Mexico on an aircraft carrier on an inspection trip. And it just, under the rules of the Senate, the next man in seniority in line had to carry the bill for us, and that was Senator Scoop Jackson, who was our friend and knew us and was all for statehood, and he did a marvelous job, and he put it through. We found politicians will play these games and give you little signals, and you got to listen carefully and mind your P's and Q's. Now, there was a senator from Florida going to make a speech against statehood on a procedural motion to advance the bill, and we didn't want him to make that speech. And I knew his administrative assistant, and I went to him and wanted to know what could I do to convince him he shouldn't do it. And he said, well, Bob, there's no use talking to him because he's just politically obligated, and he has to deliver that speech, and there's nothing you can do about it. I said, can't I talk to him? And after a little bit, he let me talk to him, and he was a good fellow. It was Spessard Holland. Many people remember him. He was a swell fellow. And when I was talking to him, why do you have to make a speech? And he couldn't explain. It's just a political obligation. He said, of course, if I'm not in town, I don't have to make a speech. But there's my clue. And when I left, we hired a fellow down in Florida to make speaking engagements for Spessard Holland. I think more Rotary clubs and ladies' gatherings and seroptimists and everything had, and Senator Holland accepted every one of them. And he was going back to Florida over and over, and then we in Washington were trying to figure out what day is it coming up on the floor, and nobody could tell us, and it was just our luck. He was in town, and he made the speech in spite of all our effort to have him in Florida. And when I heard the speech, I heard all the phraseology that the canned salmon industry has always used, and it was definitely a canned salmon speech. So I started in with my sources, wondering how did he get a hold of that speech, and I found it came to him through Senator Malone of Nevada, who was anti-statehood, And then I worked on Senator Malone, and I could never find out how he got it. But I did find that it came from Bogle and Gates law firm in Seattle, which represented the canned salmon industry. So there we are, with the same old enemy showing up all different ways. Those are the things we lived with. And Alaskans were wonderful. They did everything. We had to do this all at our own expense. When we chartered an airplane to go back, it usually was a DC-4, which carried 55 people, so the cost of the plane was divided 55 ways, and back we'd go. And everybody paid in his own hotel bill. There's no help. And it was a purely what you call a populist movement, really populist. This started with the people, and it filtered through the political structure, and it dragged them along and made them come with us. And we finally got into the Union, and I can tell you that's one of the biggest successes, the biggest thrills, to think of a little place here, a handful of people. We were less than 200,000. We must have been about 74,000 when we started after statehood, and we were growing constantly through the years. But to go back there and refashion the American flag to make a way for our star, we all got a thrill out of it, and we're all in it, and it was a fascinating thing. And having fought for it so hard, I think Alaskans appreciate their state more than most people do. I was in a meeting in Seattle the other day, and they had an American flag but no state flag. We always have the Alaska flag somewhere, and you see Alaska flag flown all the time. In many states, you rarely see their state flag. And we have an attitude, our state is precious, and it's because all through history, Alaskans had to fight for what they got. We started out with no government. The first 17 years, Congress provided no government, and we had to plead with them to any kind of government. And then the next 12 years or so, they gave us a half-pint government, and then we had to plead for more government. And it's amazing, those of us who often find government irritating and intrusive and we don't want it around, we were pleading for it. And even, you might not believe that, but that's the way it was. And after we got it, it did everything we said it would, almost everything we said it would. It was beneficial. It opened up Alaska for development. It attracted capital, and it lifted the low ceiling that was hanging over all of us because we were not first-class citizens. We couldn't vote for government president. It gave us a full political powers like other citizens, and we could stand proud, and we're from a state, and capital did come in, oil being first, and it did open things up and make us dynamic as we were never before. And we've had a better life, more amenities, and we've been able to solve some of our own problems. And incidentally, besides solving problems that used to be made by absentee owners somewhere that we had no power to resolve, now we have the power to resolve our problems and also create our problems. And it's all up to us. And the whole future is in our hands, and it's amazing. And I'm sure our future is limited only by the limitations of our vision and our will of what do we want to do with this place. And so far we have an excellent record, I think, of a good state government rendering very good basic services. And if we stay on the ball, we can make a greater and greater state and a better and better place to live. Thank you.
That was wonderful. I feel sort of restricted because I have to talk about the progress from the 30 years since statehood. It'd be a lot more fun to talk about some of those things Bob talked about and didn't talk about, but I'm not going to do that. And I'd also much rather talk about what's going to happen than what did happen, because there's going to be some great progress, and it's going to be because of people like yourselves that haven't given up the fight. As Bob mentioned, Alaska has changed dramatically in those 30 years since it's become a state. I think our destiny as far as what we was trying to do, the goal that we had with statehood is, in my opinion though, still largely unfulfilled. We have a lot of battles still to fight. But with statehood, we've sort of addressed the poverty in the outlying areas, Alaska's villages. We've got telecommunications, we've got education, we have medicine, on and on and on. And all these things become readily available. And the environment has been greatly improved, regardless of some perception. Now, some people go around and they'll romantically say, oh, for the good old days. Yeah, I'm not one of those guys. We can complain about what didn't happen, or what did, but who wants to return to the days, and Bob and Steve, you'll remember driving on a dusty, unpaved road to Palmer. When it rained, it was too muddy, and when it didn't, it was too dusty. And as I mentioned, that the environment has been enhanced in statehood, in my opinion, because in my view, the color of the environment is not just green, it is real, and Alaska is where the country is real. And we've improved our economic situation. We don't have to debate too much on that. We can somewhat say, well, it's not good enough yet, but that has also helped our environment. Because in those days, in territorial days, basically, the work was basically government. Now, I know there's an awful lot of government employees now, but in those days, we didn't have too much of a private sector. And so statehood did give us a chance on the economic side. And it did help the environment, because when a man is cold and hungry and unemployed, you know, he's in an ugly environment regardless of his natural surroundings. And I think that since those last 30 years, our cities have improved, the arts have flourished, we've got the PAC, and the amenities have been improved, but you know, there's a long ways to go. We still have to clean up our towns. We can be proud of Alaskans, and we are, but our pride should stir us and not still us. The fight is there. You know, in pioneering countries and leaders of pioneering countries have to be vocal to get their thoughts across. Bob, as you mentioned, that you can be nice in some of those battles, but sometimes you have to be awful strong in your opinion. So let's start at the beginning of 1959. What really happened? Bill Egan was our first governor, and he did a credible job of putting that state together. Our selection of land started. A good part of Prudhoe Bay was selected in that period of time, those early years. And thank God for that, because in the mid-60s, the federal government put a land freeze on immediately after the election of our second governor, and thereby was the first infringement on the statehood compact. We also got the ferry started in the early years, Bill Egan did. Because a marine highway, unknown to other states in the Union, was literally the only surface route that we could take to tie our southeastern cities together. And I think we have a good state court system. It was started then. In fact, some of the first judges, I think, are still sitting on the bench. But no civilization under any form of government can survive or prosper without an economic base. So in the mid-60s, we elected our second governor, some guy, I don't remember what his name was. And his platform was, we're going to put Alaska on an economic footing. And let's take its economic promise. And let's fulfill some of those obligations of ownership that the state found itself with, because it's basically a state owned by the government. But most of Alaska's economic successes really came with the opening of Prudhoe Bay. That was a major event, and the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. You know, but that just didn't happen. You had to make that happen. First, by setting an attitude and atmosphere by which the owner, the government, would say yes. Because in this part of the world, in our country, without a government saying yes, basically nothing happens. Prudhoe Bay was sort of a crossroads for Alaska, but it was right. I was very personally involved in those early years. But the project was big and it was controversial. Everything about Alaska is that way. And all parts of the industry didn't agree that it should move forward. And it took most elements of our society to make it happen. And happen it did. I remember one story, wasn't told for years. I never did write about it. But in the early 1973, it became obvious. I met with President Nixon a couple of times at his request. That pipeline bill was in trouble. So in the spring of 1973, I called an old friend of mine, George Meany. And George and I met in Denver, Colorado on a Sunday. He flew out from Washington, I flew down from here. And I told him what my plan was. I said, George, we're not going to make it to Congress. And I explained to him why it wasn't in national interest, why it wasn't in Alaska's interest, and why it was in labor's interest. And he said, Wally, I want you to talk to our executive committee. And I said, when does it meet? He just said, whenever I call it. Well, he called that meeting in May of 1973, headquarters in Washington, right across from the White House. And he had 33 of the 35 international presidents there. And the only man in that room that wasn't with labor was myself and Malcolm Roberts, who was a mate of mine, and he was there sitting by the door. I still remember this. And George Meany, I was sitting next to him, and this is a great big round table. It has 35 seats. And so I started it. George introduced me, and I started making my talk. Never had a note. You wouldn't do that in the union in a setting like that. I'll never forget Paul Hall. Boy, it was going. And the letters were all kinds, and the words were four-letter words. Malcolm Roberts was getting white sitting back to the door. But I'd been in a lot of those meetings. The meeting went for 3 hours. About 5 o'clock, George walked me to the door. He says, Wally, that was great. He says, when you get to your hotel, I'll call you. I went back to the hotel, and about a half hour later he called, and he said, they adjourned without taking any action. But we're going to meet at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'll call you right after we meet. They met at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they unanimously agreed to support the bill in Congress. And he says, I have it already up in the halls going. 6 months later, we had a vote. And with all the help of industry, the executive branch of government, and many institutions, and all of labor, we only had a tie vote. One less vote than that, there's been no Prudhoe Bay. I only mention that because they don't happen. You have to help make them happen. As governor of an owner state, I believe that we should have more in-state processing, whether it's timber in the southeast or petroleum in the Kenai. So in 1967, I talked to Senator Cal and a few producers that were in the Kenai, and I decided it didn't make any sense to ship our crude oil to Los Angeles and then ship all the refined products back. After many meetings and much negotiation, very privately, industry told me that it just didn't make any economic sense. It would be unfeasible. I'll never forget when they said, after all, we have a good refinery in Los Angeles. Well, oil was selling for about $2.87 a barrel. You can imagine that. And it was stated in the press and to me personally that if we insisted that this oil be refined in Alaska, we might get $1 a barrel. We may not get anything. Well, you know, in those days, we had about 20,000 barrels of refinery that was our own oil. 20,000 barrels a day. And that was a significant amount of money for our budget. $3 a barrel, that was $60,000 a day. And our whole budget in those years was between 95 and 100 million. But I wasn't able to convince anyone. And so one morning, I'll never forget this, I was having breakfast in the mansion. In those days, you made a lot of decisions by calling a few people, and the legislature wasn't in session. I decided to act. I called a press conference and announced that we were taking our oil, and that we were going to put that oil out for bid, and the highest bidder would have to build a refinery in the Kenai. Well, all hell broke loose. And the major producers of the Kenai at that time were against it. As I recall, they didn't submit any bids at all, and I was getting pretty nervous. It looked like I was really in a box. And all at once, a small refinery from Texas, and I don't remember the name of it, not only bid more money, $3.04 a barrel, but agreed to build a refinery in the Kenai. And who built the second refinery? By the same people who said it didn't make any economic sense. And so, after that, we dedicated an LNG plant, the first LNG plant. And they were putting on a good political case. And they pressed it, but they were not successful on account of the economic and political opposition of the Northwest. Senator Magnuson was running for office that year, and Wayne Morris was running in Oregon. And so Over Freeman, Secretary of Agriculture, announced that they were going to ship 500,000 board feet of round logs out of Alaska. I protested, but I also knew that that wasn't going to work. I knew I couldn't change it unless we had an act of Congress. That wasn't possible. Or an administrative act for President Johnson. So not to cry behind or hide behind something that the Secretary of Agriculture said, I picked up the phone and I called my friend, Mr. Sasayama in Tokyo, a man I had been working with since the mid-50s. And I asked him if he'd come to Juneau immediately. This man at that time was about 74, 75 years old. 2 days later, he was sitting in my office. And I explained the situation to him that if we allowed this to happen, it would be harmful to our economy and even devastating to the pulp mills and the processing mills already existing in the Southeast. I laid out my plans, and I asked him if he could get all the importers of round logs together in a meeting in the Okura Hotel on that next Sunday evening. He said he thought he could do that. This was on a Wednesday. Well, Friday night we left. I took my Economic Development Commissioner Frank McCutcheon with me, and we met. He was a young guy then. I think he was the youngest member of my cabinet at that time. And we met in that hotel with the major log importers, and we pleaded our case, and we stated our case, and we stated our case on their side, how it didn't make any economic sense, it would harm whatever interests they had in Alaska. And lo and behold, before I left that hotel that Sunday night, we signed an agreement, 26 importers of round logs into Japan, that they would not import round logs from Alaska. We didn't make the agreement public. And I remember Secretary Freeman coming through here. He asked me to be at a press conference. I flew up and I was there, and he told the story, what he was going over there for, and I never said anything. He says, I know that the governor's not for this, but we made the decision. And he goes to Japan, he has his meeting, and he comes back by the way of Seattle. So I called Stan Patty at the Seattle Times. Bob, you remember Stan Patty. And he was a great friend of Alaskan. And on a confidential basis, I told him the story, and I said, when Secretary Freeman comes back to Seattle, I want you to interview him. And he did. And he questioned the Secretary, what happened to the round log export? The Secretary said, I don't know, but someone jerked the rug right out from under us. Well, be it what it may, that's what it takes to protect the interests of this unique country called Alaska. The battles never stop, but they're winnable. In the last 30 years, we've had the native land claims, beginning of a transfer of 44 million acres of land in a quasi-private collective ownership. And again, that was quite a battle, but it worked. We had the permanent fund that was established in the late 70s. And the transfer of the Alaska Railroad under Governor Sheffield. I think that's been a resounding success. And it's a success because it shows how government ownership can work with private management. And it's done an excellent job. But it has not, however, begun to fulfill its destiny. One more little story before I close. It was Wickersham who finally decided we needed a public railroad. He walked from Nome to Fairbanks down the Richardson, took a car down the Richardson Trail to Valdez, went to Washington, asked for 15 minutes before the joint session of Congress, spoke for 15 minutes. They applauded and said, keep on going. He spoke for 4 hours and 15 minutes, as I recall. And out of that, he pleaded his case of why they needed this kind of transportation in a country like Alaska. And out of that came a simple little act. My God, Congress wrote them simple notes. It says, this will authorize the President to build not to exceed 1,000 miles of railroad, and its primary purpose to open up the country. Not a dividend in 90 days, not a bottom line in the end of the year, but to open up the country. And think about it. If we'd have taken that amount of money and put it in a permanent fund in those days, and not really understood what wealth was, there'd be no Seward, Anchorage, or literally no Fairbanks. And so that's what the country's all about. The federal government understood at that time what it took in a cold country to make it work. So Frank, you've got 500 more miles of railroad to build, and get with it. And we still have to get our natural gas to market. You know, it was discovered there 21 years ago. I'd like to say that it's all put together during that first 30 years. We didn't quite make it. But Alaska's only beginning. And I don't have to tell you that they're a strong, strange breed. They're a blend between the environment and development. And they know the uniqueness of both and the necessity of both. 50 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say we had a good start. Until we look back and see that we still have a long ways to go. Yes, our concern for the total gives us a unique opportunity, and it gave us some. To be tremendously helped with oil development, the improvement of all our services, from law enforcement to education, to the living of life and to the enjoyment of life, to our public and private universities, including the spectacular resurrection, if I might use the word, of APU through the generosity and initiative of the private sector. Let me close by telling you that I missed a meeting in Washington, D.C. today. NASA had asked me to join a group of 8 people to an advisory group for long-term exploration. I said yes because I believe there's no end to pioneering. We like to call ourselves the last frontier, but there's no such thing. There will always be frontiers. And the world needs our frontier kind of thinking. The world needs big projects. And the world needs to know the balance between energy and the environment. It needs to know that Russia isn't a half a world away, but it's an ice age. And that we want to open those borders and expand our international trade. And that's why we're going to keep on going. I thank you.
Small minds talk about things, mediocre minds talk about people, and great minds talk about ideas. More than 30 years ago, a group of great minds seized the idea of statehood for Alaska. They pursued it relentlessly until they were successful, and all of us here and our children will be forever thankful to them for their vision and dedication in seeing this through. For me, I was so young at the time that I remember most about statehood was a huge bonfire down on the Park Strip. And people brought wood from everywhere. It must have been 50 feet high. But long after that fire went out, those flames still burn in the hearts of Alaskans who care about our state and want to make it the best it can possibly be. Alaska is 30 years old now as a state in human terms. the age of maturity. So I think it's really appropriate now that we take a sense of where we are in history and also contemplate what the future may hold for us. I'm going to start straight off with some predictions here of some events and trends I think we're going to see in Alaska over the next 30 years. First, you will see local government and coalitions of local government play a major role in economic development in Alaska. Alaska tourism will increase from 1 million to 3 million people a year, largely based on increased sports fishing and winter tourism activity. Anchorage and Fairbanks airports will take further advantage of their strategic location and increase their role as international transshipment hubs. A large part of this air cargo will be fresh fish products, both from our traditional fishing operations and from a fully developed Alaskan mariculture industry. Alaskan products will be shipped to the European market, strengthened by the formation of the European Common Market by Soviet icebreakers to the Trans-Arctic shipping route. This will include timber and minerals from southeast and south central Alaska. I believe the Red Dog Mine and the North Slope coal fields will also be serviced year-round by this Soviet icebreaker activity. Alaskan fisheries products will also reach the European market in this manner. Superconductivity will allow Alaska, the Soviet Union, and Canada to tie together in an international code generation gridwork of electrical supply. Alaskans will communicate with their Pacific Rim trading partners through fiber optic cables or through a new Soviet satellite, which is now being positioned over the Pacific Rim. Alaskan military bases will be strategic centers for the verification of arms control treaties. Alaska's marine ports and airports will form a port authority to achieve financing capability outside state government, and the improvements they will make will vastly improve Alaska's capability for international trade. Alaska will be a center for Arctic research on the greenhouse effect and other elements of global change. Alaska and 7 North Pacific nations will form an international fisheries science and trade association to promote fisheries in the entire North Pacific. The Alaska National Wildlife Refuge will be developed following a compromise with environmentalists which would call for the building of a new pipeline, a Trans-Canada pipeline following the Alcan. In its place will be a natural gas pipeline to Valdez feeding a large petrochemical facility there. And I also believe that Alaska will have a profitable, environmentally sound mining industry. All these would result in a far more stable economy for Alaska, an economy at a sustained, reasonable level at a population probably of about 500,000 people. But how will we get there from our current troubled economic situation? Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the example of Japan. We watch them a lot because they have been extremely successful. They are one of the most dramatic examples of rebuilding a devastated economy following World War II. First, they had a plan, a strategic plan, nothing really revolutionary, just a real truthful identification of their realistic economic potentials and a critical path how to get there, a regular path that any company would take. But it wasn't even a totally Japanese plan. There's nothing magic about it. In fact, a lot of it took place by U.S. advisors that went to Japan. One of the key elements of this plan was the role of education and research in economic development. And I think it's very appropriate today that we are also celebrating 30th year anniversary of Alaska Pacific University, because our research and education institutions will be one of the most critical aspects of economic development in Alaska. In Japan, after World War II, more than 4,000 school buildings, 80% of their books and school supplies were destroyed by bombing. In 1946, the U.S. Education Mission went to Japan as part of the rebuilding effort. As a result, the Japanese Education Reform Council was formed to fully integrate Japanese education and research into overall economic development plan. And to this day, that integration is one of the major reasons for continued Japanese success, both domestically and internationally. Real research will tell you whether a grain terminal at Valdez makes sense or a Delta Barley project. Real research will tell you whether a local government can pay the maintenance and operating costs for a large publicly constructed facility. It will allow us to correctly identify priorities. Education will train our people to realize the plans that we have made. Targeted research and education is absolutely indispensable to rebuilding of Alaska's economy. The Japanese success is more than just investment in education and research. It's more a question of social will, really, from what we've seen. A willingness to look out for the good of the whole and to really take the long-term view. We've gained a lot in statehood in 30 years. We have many things which we never had. But in this area, social area, this is one area where we have lost. I remember growing up as a child in Anchorage, we didn't even have a key for our door. We'd think nothing of leaving hunting for a week and leave the house unattended. I'd leave my bike on the sidewalk, know it would be there when I came back. And I think this really struck home to me and to a lot of us when Tom Fossio and his family were killed in a house surgery a few years ago. And I think it shows us the terrible price we all pay when the sense of individualism, which we're proud of, is carried to the extreme of a total disregard for society. I think that we must fully restore this sense of pride to Alaska. The basic pride of caring for and showing respect for each other. It's sad that in some ways we're our own worst enemies. I see a lot of guys out there working hard. For every guy you got out there trying to do something for Alaska, you got 4 other people trying to tear them down. You see that over and over. If the idea comes from Anchorage, the Bush is automatically suspicious. If the Republican has the idea, well, the Democrat doesn't like it because that could make him look good. And even petty personal politics often seems to be the order of the day. Our government no longer has the luxury to waste time like this. Our state government will play a critical role in our future economic development, and we must have leaders of the highest personal integrity and a commitment to rebuilding Alaska's economy as their first priority. You know, the fisherman that Hobo Jim told you about that went to Dutch Harbor, I got to tell you the rest of that story. Well, he went down in a boat out there, and he went up to the pearly gates, and, well, he wasn't really a good guy, but he really wasn't a bad guy, and they weren't sure where to put him, heaven or hell. He wasn't sure which way he wanted to go, so he said, well, couldn't I take a look? They said, okay, we'll show you hell first. He went down there. Here's a long table, totally filled with food. People sitting around it, everyone skinny, yelling, screaming at each other. You notice they all had spoons that were about this long. None of them could get the food from their plate to their mouth. Wow, that's really hell, you know, have all this food in front of you, you can't eat any of it. They said, well, show me heaven. So he goes up there, and he's amazed. It's exactly the same scene. A table sumptuously set with food, people with the long spoons, but everyone happy and smiling, and what they've done is they're reaching across the table and feeding each other. I think this picture really fits. Our table is sumptuously set with abundant resources, and we will prosper if we use our tools to help each other. But who's going to be sitting at the table? If we're to achieve our economic dreams, they will be accomplished on a regional basis. For Alaska, this means the North Pacific Rim. It has been this approach which has been responsible for the phenomenal economic success of our community of Unalaska Dutch Harbor. We ignored the people who laughed at us when we said that we would be a major player in national and international fisheries politics. This year, our export value of fisheries will approach $1 billion. Next year, over $200 million in additional investment in shoreside processing, increasing our processing capacity to over 3 million pounds a day. We've accomplished this through reaching out and forming coalitions, not by looking only at what we can do for ourselves. And I think the same is true to Alaska. We helped form the Southwest Municipal Conference, a municipal coalition. We've helped form Ports Alaska. We work very closely with Seattle and Tacoma and our partners in the fishing industry in Washington. At the time of statehood, they fought us, and they were definitely against us. We need to look past that, and where we have common interests with them, we need to work together. To do otherwise is totally self-destructive for both of us. We've also done this by reaching out to the nations of the North Pacific, especially Japan. Now 14 nations of the world call on Dutch Harbor, and among these, one of the most important is the Soviet Union. Now let's fully recognize the importance of this relationship. It's not just the money, although we did about $24 million worth of business with the Soviet Union last year. It's the cooperation in research, management, and environmental protection of the Bering Sea, which provides 30% of total U.S. fisheries production. Alaska is important to the United States and to the Soviet Union. We've seen this very clearly during the last two summits, although a lot of talking was done and some agreements were made on intermediate nuclear forces. Some of the most concrete proposals to come out of it. One was Schultz and Shevardnadze signed a deal on fisheries cooperation in the Bering Sea. And the second was recently accomplished by Secretary of State Baker and Shevardnadze, who signed an agreement for joint oil spill contingency response in the Bering Sea. Alaska is special to the Soviet Union, and we can take advantage of that fact. The delegations coming here, the delegations we are sending to the Soviet Union are strong confidence-building measures between our two nations. If in this process we can contribute to the cause of world peace, it would be the greatest gift we could ever give. I don't mind telling you that it scares me to know that in geopolitical terms, Alaska is a battleground similar to Europe. And maybe we're a little bit more sensitive to that in Dutch Harbor because we're one of the few American cities that knows what war on your own soil is like. But regardless of where you're from, I would say that all Alaskans have a very clear stake in the improving relations between the United States and the USSR. This evening I've tried to raise some issues which speak to our thinking on how we work together with each other and with our regional neighbors. Our ability to work together will be the most important determining factor in the future of our state. And it's already starting to happen. Across our state, communities are banding together to promote their common interests. Bush communities and Anchorage are exploring their obvious interdependence as primary producers and service centers. The ports of Alaska are organizing to promote international trade. Alaskans are recognizing the need to work together, and it feels good. It feels like the Alaska that I remember growing up here. This is the best sign we have that the next 30 years of Alaskan statehood will hold a bright future for all of us. Let's let it begin right here. Let's make the commitment that we will deal with each other on the basis of ideas, like we did during the fight for statehood, not on the basis of political labels. Labels are for soup cans, not people. Ideas are like sails. Let us think of the great invisible ship that carries our destiny, our human destinies upon eternity. Like the ships of our ocean, she has sails and she has ballast. The fear that she may pitch or roll upon leaving the dock is no reason to store the sails in the hold with the ballast. They were not woven from molders side by side with cobblestones in the dark. Ballast exists everywhere. All the pebbles of the harbor, all the sand of the beach will stand for that. But sails, like ideas, are rare and precious things. Their place is not in the murk of the well.
All of us. And I want to the possibility of a constitutional convention every 10 years, Steve. And I believe the next shot is 1991. 92. If members of the panel think that some of the issues that face the state are to be addressed successfully through a convention, or if they think that some of the exciting and confident vision of Mayor Fuhs might make unnecessary a convention, what would be the best way to use these next 2 years as we get our minds and our thoughts together for the movement of our state forward? We'll start with Steve. Steve, would you
regain citizens' control of the legislature? By that, it may require a constitutional convention, primarily because the legislature itself will not inaugurate anything that the public could vote on, which might, one of the main problems we have is the manner in which the legislation is handled. It's referred and referred and referred to committees, and it may go into a hostile committee and be suppressed. Or the bill, which may be a good idea, is held in hostage so that somebody is going to have to vote for some piece of legislation that he doesn't really want to vote for, or his constituency doesn't want or wish to pass. But nevertheless, why, it's either vote the way the committeeman wants you to vote, or the bill is dead. In the Constitutional Convention, we can changes then that wouldn't require any changes now.
Bob, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I would approach the idea of a constitutional convention with fear and trepidation. If it's possible to avoid it, it certainly ought to be, because the circumstances under which the original convention was held can never be duplicated. That was an election held by a bunch of Alaskans who wanted success. They weren't special interest groups looking for something. That Constitution was a gimmick. It was part of our effort to become a state. It was to prove and, we hope, silence those people who were continually saying that we weren't trained in government up here, we didn't know how to govern ourselves, and we couldn't do it. So we did it. Now, we did it by having a nonpartisan election. And we took the convention and held it at the University of Alaska, took it out of June, to break up all the channels of the lobbyists and the special interest groups down there, to get it out of there and get it in an academic atmosphere. And the whole thing was very successful. They operated up there as though it was a classroom, studying the documents that had been prepared on how you write a constitution, with the political scientists from all over the country advising them. And it was a very serious thing, and they did an excellent job.
Governor Hickel?
Well, I can see where Steve's coming from on maybe some amendments. I think it'd be safer to work on amendments than really a constitutional convention. We have a tendency in our society that when men don't do something right, we want to change the law, change the statute. Hell, change the man. And I think that'll solve more problems than anything else.
I think as a practical political consideration, you're not going to see a constitutional convention because people of all political persuasions are too afraid of what the other guy might do to them. I think that our Constitution has worked well, and that people in general would not support a constitutional convention. I think our initiative and referendum processes have worked well. When government doesn't work, people can take it directly to a vote, and that's been very successful. And besides, if you think the legislature meets for a long time, see how long a constitutional convention is.
One person tonight would like Governor Hickel and Atwood to comment on President Eisenhower's role in statehood. My understanding is that originally he was opposed. And what did you fellows do to put a half Nelson on? Bob, do you want to start with that?
Well, Secretary Seaton, Wally, you can talk about Secretary Seaton and his role. I back up before that, when Ike was first president, he was surrounded by anti-statehooders. The Secretary of the Interior and all of the bureaucrats under him were anti-statehood. And an anti-statehood was appointed governor of Alaska. And it was just going all over the place. The Congress was a Republican when I was in there. And I spent 2 months in Washington trying to figure out why I couldn't get that statehood bill to advance. It was held up in some committee. And I went everywhere and did everything, and it couldn't budge. And all the indications were that President Eisenhower was the only one that could move it. So I wanted to see President Eisenhower, and I found all my normal channels to going to the president were blocked by all these anti-statehooders who were all through the Interior Department and everywhere else. And my delegate to Congress from Alaska, who we usually look to for help, was a Democrat, and he couldn't even approach the administration. So I went to my newspaper friends, and my newspaper friend said, well, Bob, any editor visiting Alaska can stop and pay his respects to the president. It's quite common. He says, I'll get you on the list to go see the president. So I was told when to go and see the president. It was on Saturday afternoon. It was unannounced. It wasn't on any list. It wasn't published. And I was to go see the president. So when I got there, Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, gave me instructions. He knew what I was watching for and what I was interested in. He said, now, Bob, the rules are that a visiting editor can pay his respects, but he doesn't bring up anything. You talk only about what the president talked about. And he said, are you willing to play by those rules? And I said, sure. And so we went. Just the three of us, with Jim Haggerty sitting there glaring at me. And when I'm introduced from Alaska to Alaska, I recollections of his visits to Alaska. He'd been here at least 3 times during the war as a general, and I'd been at dinner parties with him and mingled with him in different ways. And I didn't know whether he remembered me or not, but he did. He remembered Alaska, and he started recalling all of his visits to Anchorage. And we had a nice talk with Jim Haggerty sitting there. And then after we ran down, we talked about everything. I said, now, Bob, about statehood. And old Haggerty, he started. And off we went, and I think for at least 30 minutes we talked about statehood. He said he was reputed to be opposed to it, but he had secret things on the drawing boards for defense at that time. Turns out that they were looking for locations for the missiles that are in Wyoming and North Dakota down there now, but they were thinking about Alaska, and they wanted a free hand to operate in Alaska, and if we were a state, we'd have state lands and all different rules, and he could tolerate that. So he came up, he said, if you talk about statehood south of the Yukon River and the Porcupine River, that might be all right because it's up in the northern area. And I said, no, we want statehood for all of Alaska, not part of it. But how about if we don't select any lands north of there, and we've got to talk that way? He said, that's fine. You select your state land south, leave that all federal, and I can do anything we want up there. You just talk about it that way, and off I went from there with the ideas he had planted. And I went to all my enemies in the Senate who were opposing statehood and told them what I said, and glory be, they got out maps I'd never seen. Their secret maps just splitting up the last 12 different ways. And they want to know, did he say this, did he say that? And in very short order, it started taking shape. It turned out to be the Yukon-Porcupine line that's in the statehood bill. It became part of the bill where we couldn't select that land without permission of the federal government. And we got Prudhoe Bay by a fluke that Phil Holdsworth was here to tell you about. Marvelous story. And I was not opposed, and he said he wasn't opposed. It's just that military consideration. Once we get that resolved, he said he's all for statehood. Then time goes on, and he got Secretary Seaton, and Wally was very close to him. He said, well, many of us were. We were all back there to see him, and he's the man that fired it up really in the final days
I'll add a brief comment. When we chartered that airplane, we flew back to Washington with 55 of us to see the president. I think it was 54, 55. And Delegate Bartlett called me and said, we're only going to allow a small group in, and Senator Butler is not going to allow this to happen unless you help me select the list, because I was the elected national committeeman, the only one that had a vote. And so we never talked about it much, and so we picked 17 people, and Chairman Adams insisted that I could talk, and I could introduce one person. That was sort of difficult, and I worked that out. I had Johnny Butrovich in my mind, because Johnny Butrovich makes me look good no matter what. He gets rough. So Eisenhower come up behind his desk, and he sat on the front of his desk. You know, he's bald-headed, and I'm standing on the right, on the left, people are coming around. And Sherman Adams is right next to me, and I'm talking, and I talked about this line that was going, we could only get our lands from. I told him we were statehood for all of Alaska. I was getting a little strong, and he was getting a little red, and I tossed it to Johnny Butlerich, the only other guy that was allowed to talk. And Johnny gave a historical speech, and I'm telling you, they thought I was rough. He really got rough. Eisenhower, when he was finished, Johnny made a great presentation. He looked at the crowd, and he looked over at me, and he said, well, at last, I'm glad you think I'm an American. And here we sit there in the president's office, look, with a bunch of Alaskans, and the president of the United States saying, I'm glad you think I'm an American. But let me say with that Adams talked to me later. In fact, he was jerking on my sleeve, and he says, Hickel, shut that man up. I didn't say nothing. And he was a tough little guy. And Barry White's here. He knew him well. And finally, he jerked on my shirt sleeve again. He says, Hickel, shut that man up or you'll never get back in here. I said, well, we're going to tell our story. We're in here now. And long story short, that was a fine edge. A battle sometimes gets awful close to the edge of going either way. Alaskans won with that, and McKay was relieved as Secretary of Interior. Seton came in. Eisenhower put statehood people around us. Seton made many trips up here, went through many of the battles with us, no matter where they were. And so Eisenhower, if there isn't any doubt in my mind, I happened to be the last cabinet officer that saw him before he died. He talked about some of those things. And I'll say that, without a doubt, Eisenhower is for statehood because it was a human right thing to do. And what he's talking about the military is real, but in his heart he was there.
We have time for one more question, and I'm going to address this to Mayor Fuhs. We're prevailing a little bit on the time we said we complete, but we do need to ask this question. I beg your indulgence. Paul, what do you think is the appropriate future use and misuse, possible misuse of the permanent fund in the direction in which you go in Alaska? How should it be used? Should it be used to assist in the development of capital and industry, or should it remain what it is today, something of a sacred cow?
Well, I remember when it was first formed, and the idea was we're going to put this money aside so that when we don't have the revenue anymore, that we are going to be able to use that interest. And I think we should be able to use the interest. The idea behind it wasn't to just make a permanent savings account that just got bigger and bigger and bigger. For what purpose? To let the stockbrokers and the bankers play around with it? I mean, I'm sure it's fine for them, but that was for a public purpose. It's more than us just getting a check, too, although that's probably the best thing that that's never done away, because everyone will then have a stake in maintaining the principle. But I've heard several ideas come out which would take and use part of that money, that interest money, to endow foundations, to endow education in Alaska. And I think that could be the highest purpose for that. It creates a mini permanent fund with that, and those institutions then can live off the interest of that. I think that would be the highest public use of those funds.
We've had time tonight only to stir the surface on some of these exciting issues. Any one of these remarkable persons here tonight on the platform could have used the entire evening reminding us of where we've been and where we ought to be going. I want to thank the State Chamber of Commerce, George Cruz and David Hickel, other officers of the Chamber, for joining Alaska Pacific University in this celebration. We look forward to seeing you all 30 years from tonight in this same place, and we'll then assess where we have been in the first 60 years of statehood in Alaska. I'm a relative newcomer. I've yet to collect the permanent fund check. But I believe in this state. I think it's one of the most remarkable communities in the entire world. We have a great opportunity to do here things that other communities have only dreamed of. And I pledge to you the energies of my university in working with private sector organizations represented here tonight to make that dream possible. We're going to close tonight by standing and singing together the Alaska song led by Teresa White. Let us stand and join in this hymn.
Please join me. The words are on the back of your program. 8 stars of gold on a field of blue, Alaska's flag may it mean to you. The blue of the sea, the evening sky, the mountain lakes and the flowers nearby, the gold of the earth is born of spring, the precious gold of the hills and streams, the brilliant stars in the northern sky, the bear, the dipper, and shining high, the great north star with its lily light, o'er land and sea a beacon bright. Alaska's flag to Alaskans bear, a simple flag of our last frontier. Thank you and good evening.